Good evening again. First, I want to share my thanks with Paul and with the entire clergy team and with the people of MCC Boston for inviting me back to preach for what is such a special occasion in the life of this congregation. I'm so grateful to celebrate with you the 47th and beginning the 48th year of ministry of this church, and I'm honored to be worshiping and sharing God's word with so many friends and siblings who are faithfully given to the work of justice, equality, health, and safety for all of God's creatures. Appropriately, I was first invited here by Reverend Jim Matulski after meeting him at my first ever Pride Parade in Boston 2 years ago, and it makes me proud to be here and to share, as on that day, in the expansive love of God with you all. It is through the lens of God's expansive love that I want to explore Matthew's peculiar story here, near the end of all things in Jesus' life and story. I'll bet you haven't noticed this passage before. It is easy to forget, so eager as we are to get to the resurrection, that the gospel writer, almost also seemingly eager, can't help but mention it here at the end of the narrative of Christ's crucifixion. We glide over this proto-resurrection that Matthew recounts, the tombs that crack open and the holy ones, the sleeping saints who are raised, the walking dead right here in the New Testament. And I'm betting you never noticed them before. So how do we learn to be better readers? How do we learn to read like Matthew's eerie account demands, where revenants from the past break in, where the future seems to impatiently overlap the present? How do we learn to read with attention to a time that does not flow seamlessly, in a time when everything seems a little off, a time in which the dead have been awoken before their time? Perhaps I've done an unfair thing, however, in asking us to consider this passage. After all, we've already celebrated the resurrection in our liturgical year, as well as the ascension. We journeyed through Lent as a time meant to infuse our lives with a sense of patience, of waiting and watching, walking with Jesus and his disciples through the 40 days of night his journey to the cross took. Lent is so important in this way, for it plunges us into an abyss of time beneath time, a time that slows our rush toward the end, toward victory or easy resolution. And so after making that journey to arrive on the other side of the cross in the light of Jesus' faithful life restored and hope kindled, I'm asking us to go back. Not very nice of me. Perhaps this is a difficult thing to ask, to unsettle our comfort inside of post-resurrection existence. Perhaps. But I want us to notice. I want us to pay attention to the cracks in the tombs, the disquieting silence that haunts the landscape after Christ's final cry, the spectral presence of absence that lurks in the lines of Matthew's gospel, the breathless and impatient anticipation of life in the shadow of death, the longing for a future to come inside of a hopelessness that has come to pass, that has not yet even passed, is not even in the past, not yet buried. I want us to learn to read, as Hamlet says of a tumultuous Denmark, in a time out of joint. But how to read in a time out of joint? We don't notice the dead, the holy ones, the saints who have fallen asleep, like Matthew tells us, because, like so many of our Christian siblings around the world, like the disciples, we ache to have the Messiah back, for the world to be turned upside down, for the clock to be rolled back, for the nightmare to end. And so we rush toward the end. Our eyes flit to the next verse, the next chapter, greedily seeking that subject heading, the resurrection. Time restored, chaos averted, death conquered, the night over. But when we do, we forget the dead. We miss their untimely, inexplicable re-arrival. So what is going on in Matthew 27? How to read this peculiar story of the awoken undead? Time is certainly out of joint. As the mere interpretation of this passage indicates, there are 3 plausible interpretations which all grapple with the difficulty of chronology, but only 2 of which we should explore here. The phrase in verse 53, after his resurrection could modify the entire preceding clause where the tombs split open and the dead who have fallen asleep were awoken. And we could translate it as the tombs were split open, and then after Jesus' resurrection, the dead who had fallen asleep were raised, and they appeared to many. But we can reject this on the outset, on the grounds of it being out of step with Matthew's syntax throughout the rest of the gospel, these nitty-gritty things that we really don't have to care too much about typically. Paradoxically, if we read it this way, it would assume too much to make it fit a more plausible or notional sense of time. It is more likely that it is to be read precisely as we have read it together today, that after Christ dies, the tombs are split open, and the dead who had fallen asleep were raised, and after his resurrection, then they appeared to many. This makes for difficult reading. But this is also where the apocalyptic fun begins. What were the dead doing during the time from Christ's death to his own being raised? What becomes of the dead in the meantime, the time between time, where there is no hope, where the night reigns, when anticipation gives way to antipathy, apathy, and abandonment? Eugene Boring, who's a New Testament scholar and commentator, notes of this passage that the eschatological signs that began with the darkness on Golgotha in verse 45 continue as Jesus dies. The temple curtain is split from top to bottom. An earthquake splits the rocks. The tombs of the Israelite saints surrounding the city and the Temple Mount are opened as Jesus dies. And this results in the peculiar picture of the saints as being resurrected on Good Friday, but remaining in the tombs or in the open country until after the Easter appearances of Jesus. A peculiar picture indeed. With the cry of dereliction from the cross, the earth groans and shifts, and the rock face splits open in the countryside, reveals the places where the righteous dead lie resting, and as the whole world seems to exhale with God's Son, life is breathed into these holy dead. Can you imagine opening your eyes again after having closed them for the last time in death and not knowing what comes next? What sort of accounting of time is this? How did these saints, once asleep, now awake, think of their strange and sudden revivification? How did they read their in-betweenness? And what do we make of the righteous dead who have suddenly awoken in a time out of joint? Or differently, how did we not notice? How did the saints, now awake, manage to go unnoticed until their appearance after Easter Sunday? Whether they were in their tombs or gathered together in some spectral congregation outside the city, surely their presence did not go entirely overlooked. Had they been so quickly and so easily forgotten? But perhaps it's not so surprising. It's so easy to forget the dead and to read right past them. It's a national pastime, after all, to leave the dead buried and in past time. We gloss over histories of suffering and the crass particularities of oppression, the fine and tedious exigencies of loss, fear, hunger, sickness, old age, as well as the more massive, seemingly glaring instances of historical suffering, genocide, ethnic cleansing, racial chattel slavery, colonization, unjust labor practices, heterosexist and misogynistic violence, ecocide, and aggregation of agonies too terrible to tell. So instead, we forget. We are pulled along in another direction. The pictures that I passed around or that I put in your bulletins as you came in are of a piece by Paul Klee entitled Angelus Novus, made most famous by a description of it written by German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin. Benjamin says of the painting, it shows the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make the whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned. while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The countless histories of suffering are piled up like so much inevitable waste from a process variably but insidiously called enlightenment, modernity, a manifest destiny of limitless expansion, upward mobility, and the American dream. And underneath the subterfuge of progress lie the bodies, the homes, the life worlds, the languages, the ecosystems, and the species of countless, nameless, and faceless victims of this forward march, a storm whose winds are so strong it compels even the wings of angels to beat in futility. The power of forgetting, of a willful and totalizing cultural amnesia, diverts our attention away from these histories of suffering. The promise of victory, of greatness, of progress, of the more which we believe we are owed in this life anesthetizes us to the cries of the suffering, blinds us to the cracks forming in the bedrock of society, and even convinces us that the righteous dead we have cut down on the way to the top cannot, will not, must not rise again, will not congregate together in a haunting throng of witnesses and lurk just outside of our well-attenuated periphery. And so we forget. And we disguise our forgetfulness as a sign of resolve, a capacity for resilience, an intergenerational boon that allows us by some awkward contortion to keep our heads down and our chins up, to not look back, but be forward-thinking. Are we not good progressives after all? And so we forget. We forget about chattel slavery, about Jim and Jane Crow, the racist foundation and perpetuation of social control in this nation. We forget about the hundreds of thousands of First Nations wiped out in the name of providence. We forget about Latino inhabitants of Central and South America whose land we appropriated, devastated, and abandoned. We forget about the trans women who led the revolution at Stonewall and the ones whose lives are ended at the hands of brutal police violence. We forget about the thousands of children we have stolen, that we continue to steal, from parents fleeing violence that the United States often has had a hand in creating, holding them in cages as hostages to dehumanize and demoralize their families and terrorize them into turning back, all who have become countless living sacrifices to the American dream. We forget about the aging and the dying, the differently abled, the mentally burdened, the chronically and terminally ill, the orphan, the widow, the disposable. We pile them all up on the ash heap of progress and stand proudly as victors over contingency, uncertainty, frailty, loneliness, sickness, and death. We've built entire edifices and institutions as shrines to our forgetting, maximum security penitentiaries, federal reservations, monuments to lost military causes, old age homes, orphanages, defunct mental health clinics, defunded veterans as hospitals, an amnestic graveyard where our insecurities, our guilt, and our national shames go to die the death of 1,000 good intentions. These are the victims of our progress, the ones that we insist on forgetting. And it's not merely that we forget them on purpose, but that our forgetting has become a matter of course. We train ourselves to read right past these people, to read ourselves and our self-interest into the present, into the scene, to read for the greater good that we didn't realize existed until we needed an excuse to forget, a conciliating mnemonic that facilitates the bloodletting that's become so integral to our culture of competition and accumulation, progress, winning, so much winning that you'll be sick of it. German Catholic theologian Johann Baptist Metz diagnosed this sort of amnestic fear appropriately as an apocalyptic fear, a fear that we might come to an end, but that the world will go on around us nonetheless. And so out of fear of meeting our ends, we foist off contingency and death onto others and disguise our forgetting as the inevitable churning of time, of the powerful over the weak, the winners over the losers. Metz wrote in 2004 that there is a fear not only that everything will come to an end and that the planet could be destined for ruin, but there is also a fear that nothing at all comes to an end anymore, that there isn't an end. There is a fear that everything is being sucked up into the wake of a faceless, merciless time which finally rolls over everything from behind like grains of sand in the sea. This dominion of time drives out every substantive expectation. It engenders that secret anxiety over identity that eats away at the souls of modern folks. It can hardly be deciphered, since for some time it has been successfully practiced under the ciphers of experiment and progress, lest it is uncovered at the roots of our own souls. We forget so that we're not faced not only with our own end, but the end of others that has come and gone, ends that have remained uninterrogated, unjustified, and unresolved. And so when the cracks start to form in a time such as ours, in the deep time beneath time, when the dead seem restless, when justice for the victims of history is heralded by the ancestors of the shattered, when their cries are raised in one voice, Black lives matter, trans lives matter, Muslim lives matter, immigrants' lives matter, cracking the carefully crafted facade of progress, purpose, and divine providence, then that fear creeps in, the fear of death and displacement and time creeping towards us. We see the unjustly dead rising up from the graves, congregating in spectral formation, imbuing their kin and kindred to take up their muffled and silenced cries, an uprising to which many in our nation react violently. Some raise a lament of sort of declension narratives, bemoaning the loss of white Western civilization and American values and Christian morals. Some shed crocodile tears for an impending white genocide. Some call for a new ethno-state. Some cry out, "You will not replace us," and some insist that there are good people on both sides. This is the fear we've come to know. It is a fear forged in the fires of forgetting, so anxious to burn up the risk of loss, the loss of power, the loss of social control, of economic hegemony, and of cultural dominance. This fear forgets time and again, time again and again, past time that might accuse us, that we must keep buried. But we must not forget. We must not forget how to read for the past, how to read for the dead and buried. Don't forget what Matthew's passage demands. At the precise point of victory for the Roman Empire over these insurrectionists, these political dissidents, when Christ cries out in protest for the countless victims of history past and history yet to come, when he and his pernicious basileia politics of God's imminent coming, a truly substantive expectation, is silenced, when progress and power and a politics of death are poised to reign, it is precisely at this point that Matthew unsettles the ground, quite literally. It is at this point, in the echo of Jesus' fading cry, at the moment where victory seems so assured, where winning is everything, it is here that creation revolts, and the righteous dead are called back and are remembered. Their bones, their dreams, the lost content of their lives are re-articulated. Not when Christ, in the newness of life promised by God, is raised himself from the grave, not when all things glow in the light of a utopian vision, the reign of God promised now realized, not when all things shall be made new. No, these righteous dead rise again in the very moment when time seems to have ground to a halt, their reanimated bodies enlivened in a time out of joint. I hope you're suddenly not regretting your invitation for me to be here. This is supposed to be a celebration, after all. And so it is, because remembering is the very substance of MCC Boston's ministry, and all of the senses that this word remembering carries. Having been so long discriminated against, dehumanized, and discarded by our nation, our social, economic, and political institutions, our religious organizations and denominations, the LGBTQIA community in Boston in 1972 gathered together and with uncanny hope and no little sense of risk to establish a Christian congregation for those otherwise forgotten. And as your history testifies that we heard during our time of offering, MCC's ministry has since then been one of remembering, of gathering people into a safe space and helping to make them whole again, putting them back together or holding them in memory if and when they were taken by illness, by violence, or by the evils of an amnestic culture. And all the while with activist voice, not letting your neighbors, your government, your religious siblings forget who you are, how you love, testifying through faithful witness to the pride and expansive love of God present among the LGBTQ community, and with uncharacteristic and uncanny grace, extending that love to those who would forget you. Where it seemed that the mainstream and magisterial Christian traditions had abandoned the emancipatory potential of the love of God, of a resurrecting and liberating love that does not wait for victory, a love that raises the victims of history as witnesses to this love, MCC Boston and congregations like it were embodying the freedom, the risk, and the faithfulness of a life at the intersection of multiple oppression, love, and hope. And you have done it not without struggle, loss, tragedy, and fear, but nevertheless with pride and with grace. You gather together now, today, this evening, as you did 47 years ago, as a remembered throng of voices and bodies and souls, as witnesses to the earth-shaking and unexpected, uncanny, and liberating love of God, shaking us all out of our complacent tendency to forget, to erase, and to elide. While you may seem spectral and marginalized and inexplicable to the oblivious world around you, you nevertheless insist in a time out of joint, bearing the fruits of constancy and worship and justice. You are the saints of a God of the living and the dead, the ones who do not wait for the arrival of the conditions of emancipation, but who create them from a faithfulness to the task of remembering in word and in deed. And it is such a witness that, as I realized my first time with you all a year ago, humbled by your invitation and your welcome, that reminds me, a cisgender, white, straight man in a world that not only reads for me and notices and remembers me, you remind me to not forget what it means to read for the forgotten, to allow, no matter how unsettling, the eschatological expectations of a time beneath time, a time that interrupts, a time that is unexpected, perhaps even unwelcome, to not forget that for the expansive love of God and for liberation, it is always time for those things. Time to resurrect the dead, for their lives and their deaths to be remembered again and again and again, for the abandoned content of their memories to be lived out in the present, for their lost futures to be enfleshed in your bodies in a time out of joint, in a time like ours when it is so easy to forget. In a time like this, you help me remember, MCC Boston. So I celebrate you, your pride and your love and your faithfulness. Just don't let me forget.